This perek speaks of one of the best kings of Yehuda, Yoshiyahu. In the next perek, we'll read about how he not only got rid of the Avodah Zara, but even the Bamot. Okay, so this is something that's been kind of like a litmus test for is this a good king or not? Okay, if he follows the ways of David and Melech, if he gets rid, of course, of Avodah Zara, and many of the kings will be, he was great, but he didn't get rid of the Bamos, right? So how could he be great if he didn't get rid of the Bamos? What are these Bamos? Bamot, and what's the difference between that and Avodah Zara? We have to keep in mind that Avodah Zara is to idolatry, whereas a Bama was to Hashem. So there were time periods in Jewish history where it was a fine and it was even a good thing to bring a korban on a. The problem is that in the times that the Mishkan stood, that you weren't allowed to bring a bama. After the Mishkan was destroyed, you could bring bamot again. But from the time that the Beis Hamikdash was built and onwards, no more bamot. They were abolished. They're not allowed anymore. At that point, it becomes aser. But it's not avodah zara. It's not yaharig ba'al ya'avor, meaning that you'd have to give your life before doing it. It's not allowed. It's aser, like many other things, but it's not clearly the same as doing avodah zara. In addition, it could have been a practice that, firstly, we can understand, as we've mentioned in the past, why a person might be drawn to this. Because if we didn't really have set tefillahs at the time, we didn't have a big Knesset, this was our main way of connecting with Hashem. Korban comes from the word karov, the karev, to come close to Hashem. And if every time that we want to try to come close to Hashem, we have to go to Yerushalayim, even if we live a great distance from there, that can be really difficult to keep up that connection. So that being the case, when we really need to call out to Hashem and we're just not close, we can understand why a person would be drawn to give a korban even on a bama. Not only that, but until then it was allowed and it was fine and it was even a good thing. Traditions die hard. It's hard to get rid of a tradition. And if this was something that people were used to, saying that from now on it can only be here was something that would have been very difficult for people to do. Right? Even in the times of Shiloh, we see that most of the people didn't even go on Aliyah Regel, especially when things became so corrupt. If that's the case, then bamos were still widespread, even if they weren't allowed in the times of the Mishkan. So we see there was always this struggle between bringing bamos, even if they weren't allowed, and having the central place of avodah in either Shiloh or Yerushalayim, or anywhere where the Mishkan stood. The Mishkan also moved after that. So that was always kind of a struggle. That being the case, we can understand why this thing was still going on, but on the other hand, that it still wasn't allowed. So you can have a king who's a good king, but he really should have gotten rid of those bamos, and he didn't. Now, that being the case, we have two kings who are exceptional, and they really did not only get rid of the Avodah Zarah, but even the Bamos. Who were these kings? Chizkiyahu and Yoshiyah. These were the two kings who really got rid of the Bamos. So we can understand how it's a hard thing to leave behind. We can understand the difference between Avodah Zarah and a Bama, and in that case, there could also be a difference in how the two are treated after they're taken apart. Because when it's Avodah Zarah, we've seen how that can be treated with Yehu, who turns it into a bathroom, basically, at least for symbolic purposes. And we actually have examples, for example, Beersheba versus Arad. Okay, both of these are fascinating sites. If you haven't been there, you should really go check it out. These are really on the periphery, basically on the border. So they're about as far south as you can get from Yerushalayim, most time periods throughout the times of Melucha. And so that being the case, we can understand that they weren't constantly coming into Yerushalayim, and they had kind of their own system. In Beersheba, when they found the Mizbeach, it had been totally dismantled, and the stones had been used in secondary use in walls of structures, meaning they really wanted to get rid of it and erase it. But they found it anyway, the archaeologists, and they understood what it was, especially when you have a stone in a wall, but it has a horn, like a horned altar, the Karnei Mizbeach. So you can kind of understand that that's not how they made it for the wall. They were able to put it back together. You can see what this Mizbeach looked like. Of course, it was a Mizbeach of hewn stone, which isn't allowed. But either way, the whole thing wasn't allowed apparently because we believe that it was probably used for Avodah Zara. So that's the case of Avodah Zara, and it was actually really dismantled and destroyed. On the other hand, in Arad, we find the Mikdash, like an entire temple, which was apparently used as a bama. We don't find any idolatry or anything like that. We do find matzevot or standing stones, which again also have kind of that blurry gray area where on the one hand it's certainly not allowed, on the other hand we find that the Avos did do it. It's not actually a structure, but it just gives us something to kind of direct ourselves towards. Either way, not allowed. We don't do that. But you find it there. They were doing it, but it wasn't actually Avodah Zara. That being the case, in this case, it wasn't totally dismantled. They closed it off. It was ganuz. It was kind of like a shemus, like if we have something that's no longer, it was holy, but it's no longer able to be used, so we kind of bury it in the ground. So this is kind of like that, where we can't use it anymore, but it was used for service of Hashem. So even though it was usher, it's not exactly something that should be turned perhaps into a toilet or a bathroom. How does that fit in with Lachish? On the one hand, they put a toilet on it. On the other hand, it was a symbolic toilet that had never been used. Unclear. It's a question maybe we'll have to get to at another time. But either way, and if you really want a weird example, we're not going to go to this now, but Mozart, they found a mikdash that was really strange. Again, also for another time. But that's how we can have a king who can be a good king but not get rid of the Bamas. That's how we can have an exceptional king who really does do both. He gets rid of both of them. But if that is the case, if Yoshiyahu was such an exceptional king that he not only got rid of the Avodah Zarah but also the Bamos, so then we're left with another question. And that's how could it be that the next perek ends so tragically? For that, we're gonna have to wait till tomorrow. So stay tuned.